Mm.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me all right? Okay. I'm just gonna give it a minute or two and let people trickle in here before we begin class. So we're just a minute early. Just wanted to say hello before we get officially started. My name is Leah and I'm with Marzocco Home. So super excited to be here. It's super sunny in Seattle today. So pretty happy about that. Got my mini with really good coffee, so I have zero complaints right now. And I'm about to get to talk to you about dialing in espresso on a more advanced level than our previous class that we taught, which was espresso basics. So that's all very exciting to me. I've been working hard all week to create some stuff for you. Really interested to see what you have to say and excited for the Q&A portion of this class. So it's 10:30 now. We'll go ahead and get started. This will be about an hour or so. I'm going to talk just briefly for about 5 minutes just to touch base and say hello. And then I'm going to launch into a video that I created specifically about advanced espresso, focusing on roast when you're dialing in. So we'll talk a little bit more in that video about why we want to focus on roast. The video itself is a little bit longer. I find that the more time I'm given, the more time I want to use when I'm talking about coffee. So it's about 25 minutes. So as soon as that video ends, we'll launch straight into the Q&A. While the video is playing, please feel free to utilize the chat feature, ask questions. Ben will be compiling a list of questions for me for the Q&A. So in addition to myself, I have Ben, Dave, Chris, and Scott with Marzocco. So they are all here manning the chat. They're being my buddies. They're great people, really knowledgeable. So they'll be able to answer those questions that you might have on a one-off basis, but then also bring them to me for the Q&A. And I'm just like, there's a few chat things popping up. I saw someone was saying hello from Transylvania, someone from Sri Lanka just right now. So people from all over the world, thank you so much for being here, especially during this time when things are kind of unstable and uncertain. Taking a moment to brew a coffee, to spend time in community with each other, I think is really valuable and really special. So thank you so much again. And just a shout out to Scott from Marzocco USA. This was sort of his idea for this class that he shared with me. And so I'm really excited to try to bring it to life, but definitely following in his footsteps on this one. So hopefully I do him proud. But we'll go ahead now, since I think we have enough people in, that we'll go ahead and start the video and talk about what we'll be discussing today, which is advanced espresso dialing in by roast. So I'm going to pause my video for just a second, and then I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of learning. So again, just 1 second here while I pause my video, and I will be right back. Hello, and welcome to Advanced Espresso, Dialing in by Roast Level, brought to you by Marzocco Home. In today's class, we'll be focusing on roast level and using it as a main consideration when choosing our brew ratio or recipe for our espresso. Now, we talk more about brew ratios in the Espresso Basics class, which you can also find as a video on our YouTube channel. And I would recommend starting there if this brew ratio concept is new to you. But even as someone who has worked commercially for a long time, brew ratio is something I return to again and again because I can play with the concentration of my coffee. So I'm not changing flavors, so to speak, of my coffee, but I'm enhancing the inherent characteristics of my coffee by using more or less water. Super concentrated, creamy body ristretto, or light, floral, thin tea-like body in a lungo. I'm using the brew ratio to highlight different aspects of the coffee itself. So it's a tool to bring out and show what's already in the bean. It doesn't necessarily change the inherent characteristic of the coffee. So what does brew ratio have to do with roast level? Well, we can use our roast level of our beans to help narrow down a range of brew ratio that we might want to start experimenting with. And the reason we use roast to help determine our brew ratio has to do with density. Now, there are a couple things that can affect the density of your coffee bean, and that could be elevation, how high the coffee was grown, the varietal of coffee. So there's different types of coffee beans, sort of like there's different varieties of apples. But we're not going to pay attention to those so much this class. We're focused more on roast. So darker roast tends to be less dense than lighter roast, which tends to be more dense. And that just has to do with the roasting process itself. So darker roasts are roasted for longer, the cell structure of the bean is more degraded, and that ties into brew ratio because it gives up what's good about the coffee, so things like acids and sugars, sooner. Because it's so porous, the water is able to dissolve those acids and sugars into the espresso faster than they would with the lighter roast, which generally needs more work done to be able to penetrate the dense bean to dissolve the sugars. So for darker roast, we generally will use a ristretto between 1:1 and 1:2. And for a lighter roast, we'll generally go more in the normale to lungo range, 1:2 all the way up to 1:4. And again, with lighter roast, that's because the lighter roast is more dense. So the water has a harder time dissolving everything it needs to dissolve. So we need to expose it to more water overall, which will allow it enough time to dissolve those beautiful sugars and get those beautiful, more delicate flavors associated with light roast. But overall, the rules are meant to be broken. I'm sure there's light roasts that are great as a ristretto and dark roasts that are great as a normale. But those are just some general guidelines to pay attention to. So something I mentioned in the Espresso Basics class, but didn't give you a visual for, was our espresso extraction curve. Today we're going to be using this graphic a lot so you can visually see what I'm tasting, because unfortunately we can't taste these shots together, which is the best way to figure out what's going on in your coffee. But the best way to interpret this chart here is starting in the lower left corner, the beginning of that semicircle. That is water hitting the coffee. As soon as water hits coffee, regardless of whether it's espresso or ground for pour over, it doesn't matter the brew method, it starts this process of extracting things from the inside of the delicious coffee bean. The water starting to dissolve parts of the coffee because water is a solvent. So when water hits the coffee, it starts out in that lower left corner, and then it starts to dissolve some salts. As it continues, it starts to dissolve acids, and it goes a little bit longer. It starts to actually break down complex carbohydrates, sugars, and make them into simple sugars, which we can taste, which is where you get like a sweet, delicious shot of espresso. And then if that water sits too long or takes too long to pass through the coffee or dissolves too much, it actually starts to dissolve solids, and that's the plant fiber inside of the bean. So overall, there is sort of a sweet spot on this extraction curve where we're trying to dissolve acid and sugar, but not go so far that we actually start to dissolve solids. So at the top, you'll notice there's under extraction, proper extraction, and over extraction. And those are all things you can actually taste for. So if you're tasting something under extracted, it will be pretty acidic, maybe like battery acid, and maybe kind of heavy and salty, soy saucy, and there's no sweetness at all. So you know you haven't extracted long enough, either in volume of maybe you need to increase your ratio, or in time. Maybe it passed through too quickly, the water, so it couldn't dissolve all of the sweet stuff in the coffee. So you might need to adjust your grind at that point. Proper extraction includes salt and acid, but it has the addition of sugar, creating something that has acidity, it has maybe body, viscosity to it, but also a sweetness that wasn't present before. So proper extraction isn't all sugar, it actually does have elements of acidity and salt as well, creating a balanced shot. So it should have sort of all three notes, the acidity, the body, the sweetness, hopefully in harmony, but definitely they're all present there as a good indicator that you're reaching proper extraction. And under extraction is going to taste like broccoli stalk, kale, paper bag. It's going to be thin and watery. It's going to be kind of diluted. It also has the quality I call of a Houdini shot, or one that you taste and then it immediately disappears from your mouth. So it doesn't have a lingering aftertaste. It's just generally sort of flat, papery, and not delicious. Now, you can also use this graph to think about something called total dissolved solids, which is actually how much of the coffee is being dissolved into the water, which you measure using something called a refractometer. And there's a certain percentage, usually between like 19 and 22%, is the ideal TDS for most coffees. A little bit higher for espresso, but refractometers are expensive. And in general, I find that you can taste for proper extraction at home. And then the TDS, if you were to do that, usually confirms what you're tasting. We could do a whole class on TDS, but that's not this class today. So today we are going to be focused on what we're tasting in terms of extraction. And we can talk more about TDS in the Q&A or at maybe some other time. All right, let's get to the coffee. So today's darker roast is going to be from Onda Origins. They are local here to Seattle, Washington. Great company. I recommend checking out their website. And I put darker and not dark roast because it's all relative. So in the context of Onda's offerings, this is their darker roast. Compared to another roaster, it might not be as dark, it might be more dark. It's all relative based on the roaster scale of what like light and dark is. So that's why the parentheses, this is a darker style roast. It's also a blend, and it's what we're going to be using as our dark roast for today's experiment. We'll talk more about the coffee in just a bit. For our lighter roast, we're going to be using a single origin Guatemalan, also from Onda. So in this context of their roast styles, this is on the lighter side for them. And this is what we'll be using for our lighter roast. Again, it's a single origin, not a blend, a little bit different. Very delicious coffee. And again, I recommend going to Onda Origins website. You can place an order online if you'd like to experiment with these coffees yourself at home after you watch this video. All right, so let's look at these beans. Can you tell which one is lighter and darker? Kind of, not really, right? Well, actually on the left is the darker roast, the Neo Noir from Onda, and on the right is the single origin Guatemalan. So I just put this on to illustrate that you can't always visually assess roast very easily. It's there and you can kind of see it, but it's subtle. When the coffee's ground, you can see it just a little bit better. So over on the left is the dark and on the right is the lighter roast. But again, it's very subtle. So just visually assessing roast doesn't always do the trick, because you can end up with two coffees that taste a lot differently and visually they don't look much different. So I always go by whatever's on the bag. So in this case, let's check out the Neo Noir from Onda, our darker coffee today. So this Neo Noir I mentioned before is a blend. And so blends are usually two origins or two different places in the world blended together. And that is the case for this bag of coffee. This is going to be a Sumatran and a Guatemalan blend. So when I look at the back of the bag, there's a few things that I want to look at when I want to start developing a recipe. One is the tasting notes. So here I have toasted marshmallow, praline, and dark chocolate. Those notes lead me to believe that this coffee is on the darker side. If it didn't explicitly say so on the bag, I could look at the tasting notes and it would lead me to believe that this is a darker coffee. So marshmallow, maybe a sweet and syrupy type of body, dark chocolate, so it has a nice roast to it, and maybe something a little bit bitter, but pleasantly bitter, and then praline, which would be sort of a nutty characteristic to the coffee itself. So I'm thinking already that I want to lean towards a syrupy shot, which would be more on that restricted or ristretto side. So I'm thinking I'm going to try a more restricted brew ratio just by reading these notes, because I want to preserve body. So I'm going to reduce the amount of liquid out to try to get to that syrupy, delicious, sweet tasting note situation that I'm assessing there. Now, something else to pay attention to on the bag, and one of the reasons I love Onda so much is they have all this information on their bags. Not every coffee roaster offers this, but most of my favorites do, and that's information about where it was farmed. This can also give you more information on dialing in, specifically the processing, wet hulled, natural, washed, that's all good information, and then the elevation at which it was grown. So this has two different farms here, and it tells the elevation for both. The elevation that a coffee is grown at can affect its density, which can also affect how we dial it in. That will also be a separate class, but that's just something to pay attention to on the back of the bag. Would be, does it have information on the farmers? And if so, what do I do with it? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for now, definitely keeping in mind that this is below 1,500 meters above sea level, and that there's a Sumatran and a Guatemalan in this blend.
So we know the coffee is a dark roast and we know it's a blend. So those two things lead me to believe that I need to have my temperature set at the lower side of my range, which is between 199 degrees Fahrenheit up to 203 degrees Fahrenheit for espresso is a general range. So I'm going to have it on the lower side around 199.5 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Darker roasts tend to extract more quickly because the beans themselves are less dense because they've been roasted for longer, and that changes the cell structure, making them more porous. So the water doesn't need to be as hot because it has less work to do. Again, thinking of water as a solvent, the hotter the water is, the more effective it is as a solvent. Because I can dissolve a darker roast more easily, I don't need the solvent to be as effective, or I don't need the water to be as hot. So darker roast, generally you can lower your temperature by a few degrees and that will lead to something a little bit sweeter in your cup. So I have this set at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So now that I have my temperature set and I know kind of what my roast is, I want to pick a brew ratio. So I mentioned darker roasts like more of a ristretto style. So I was thinking with this coffee, I would go for a 1 to 1.75 ratio. So that's right below normale. I tend to like shots that are on the longer side or a higher ratio. So I'm still playing within that ristretto frame of 1 to 1 to 1 to 1.75, but I'm right at the top end of it. So that is just me kind of choosing a starting place based on my experience level. You could start out with just a straight 1 to 1 and then go up to a 1 to 1.5. But you just kind of have to pick a place and begin in that range. And I chose my ratio based on my knowledge of my own preferences for brew ratio. So that's really where you need to start, is have a good sense of what you like to drink. And that will guide you to choosing your right brew ratio in addition to the roast level that you're using. So let's get started with the machine here, some action shots, if you will. So here I have my portafilter, and I'm going to go ahead and pop out my basket to see what size it is, because that's going to help me get a starting place of how much coffee needs to go into the basket. In this case, this is a 17-gram basket, so I can go plus or minus 1 gram. So I could go 16 grams all the way up to 18 grams in that basket. In this case, I'm going to use 16 grams in on the lower side of what the basket can hold. So I'm going to go ahead and grind right into the basket, and you can see here that it's a fine grind, and the Lux D Mazzer grinder that I'm using works just by pressing straight against that button, and it keeps dosing. And then you can see that I have a nice mounded heap of espresso. When I'm done grinding, I put it on the scale to see how much that is. I'm looking for 16. If it's a little over, I'll use my finger to knock just a little bit off, put it back on the scale. Hopefully it's at 16, which it is. Then I'm gonna settle it a couple times with my hand, which is optional. And then I'm going to use my distributor to smooth out the espresso. So instead of that heaping mound, I'm making it nice and flat. So when I go to tamp or use a big hunk of metal to exert force on it, it's going to be more even, making the bed more evenly dense throughout. So there's not different densities in the bed. So I'm going to grab it like a door handle, press straight down with 30 to 50 pounds of pressure. Again, I recommend going back to the espresso basics class if you want to see a start to finish pulling a shot more in detail. Now that I have my shot ready, let's see what that 1 to 1.75 ratio looks like. So I put the cup on the scale and I hit tare. I also started the timer as soon as I slid the paddle over or engaged brewing. And remembering I have 16 grams in and I'm doing that 1 to 1.75 ratio. So if I do 16 multiplied by 1.75, I get 28 grams out. So I'm going to stop my shot at 28 grams on the scale. So once I see 28 grams on the scale, I'm going to turn the brew paddle to the right, which disengages the pump or shuts the machine off. So that's what I did there. And that shot took 30 seconds. And that's within my range of 22 to 32 seconds. So let's taste this shot and see where it lands on our espresso extraction curve. So when I taste this shot, I'm tasting something that is sweet for sure, syrupy, it has some acid, it has some salt, but it's just a titch over extracted. So it's just starting to get a little bit papery. It has sort of a like papery drying aftertaste. And that leads me to believe that maybe my grind was just a titch too fine. So ideally I would coarsen my grind by just a tiny bit and get that shot through a little bit faster, maybe between 27 and 28 seconds would be my ideal. But overall, this was a pretty tasty shot. I definitely picked up on those tasting notes that I saw in the bag, the dark chocolate especially, and the marshmallowy sweetness and syrupy body. All right, let's switch to the lighter of the two coffees, the single origin Guatemalan from Onda Origins. So same roaster, just a different coffee. It's a single origin, meaning it comes from one place, a farm in Guatemala, specifically a cooperative in Guatemala, and slightly lighter on the roast scale compared to this company's other offering, the Neo Noir, which was a darker coffee. So we're going to use this for espresso. Now my goal is I'm going to try to keep a few things constant. I'm going to try to keep my in at 16 grams, but I'm going to change my ratio. So I'm going to change my ratio, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but so my output's going to change. But I want to try to get it in the same amount of time. So to do that, I'm going to need to change the grind. So I'm going to need to adjust the grind to be able to get more liquid through in the same amount of time as the previous shot, which to remind you was around 30 seconds. So let's take a look at the bag before choosing a ratio, just to kind of see what we're looking at in terms of some of the tasting notes and maybe the elevation before deciding on a ratio. But that's overall what I'm trying to do, is pull a different ratio in the same amount of time, but with the same input. So here at the back of the bag, looks similar to before. It has all this really amazing information about the farmer. But if you look over on the right, there are the tasting notes. And it looks like it is sugar, caramel, chocolate, apple, honey, and grapefruit. So right away, I'm thinking something sugary. The apple makes me think something lighter, maybe a little bit more fruit forward. And then the grapefruit lets me know that there's going to be a good deal of acidity. So it's going to have sort of a bright acidity to it that the previous coffee didn't have. The previous coffee, all of the tasting notes didn't have any sort of acidity to them. Grapefruit lets me know that this is going to be a brighter shot overall. Also maybe a little bit lighter in the cup, but sugar and honey lets me know that it's going to be sweet and it should have a little bit of a viscous body. Caramel, there's sort of a buttery undertone, and then chocolate is always a good tasting note in coffee, and then that apple, there's a degree of fruitiness to it as well. So I'm already thinking that something like that might benefit from a slightly longer ratio or taller ratio. So I'm thinking maybe I'm going to go for a 1 to 2.5 ratio, or 1 to 2, a normale, but we'll see. And then going over to the origin, I see that it's a single origin Guatemalan and it's 1,700 meters above sea level. So that's 200 meters above sea level higher than the blend that we used previously. And that lets me know that maybe this coffee is going to be a little bit denser. So both the roast and the elevation contribute to density, in addition to the varietal of the coffee itself and how it's processed, all of those things. But in general, keeping in mind, lighter roasts tend to be more dense, darker roasts tend to be less dense, higher elevation, more dense, lower elevation, less dense. So already I know this is a lighter roast, a higher elevation. The tasting notes sound a little bit lighter. So I'm gonna need to change my grind and mess with the temperature to make it taste better. All right, so looking at the temperature wheel here, I have it set now a little bit hotter than I did for the dark roast. So seeing all of those clues letting me know that this is a lighter, denser coffee, I set it to 203 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a few degrees above the 200 degrees Fahrenheit I had it set at previously. And thinking about water as a solvent, it's more effective, better at dissolving if the water is a little bit hotter. So because this is a denser coffee, I need the water to do more work and be better at dissolving to be able to penetrate to the center of those grounds and actually extract the sugars and everything that we need. So I need the water to be a little bit hotter, which is why I turn it up just a few degrees. So again, in general, darker roasts like a slightly cooler water temperature, lighter roasts can handle a slightly hotter temperature. Definitely something to think about and experiment with. So considering brew ratio, I already mentioned I'm probably going to go for a higher ratio. So in this case, I'm going to try for a 1 to 2.5 ratio of coffee to water. And that's going to allow those more delicate tones like the apple and the honey to come out by diluting it a little bit or expanding it a little bit by adding more water. So the concentration is less intense and it's more delicate overall. And to do that, I need to adjust the grind. So I need to actually make the grind coarser or the pieces bigger, because again, I'm trying to get more water or more liquid out in the same amount of time as my ristretto. So I have to actually make the pieces of coffee bigger so the water can flow through faster. So I adjusted my grind. I made it a little bit coarser. And now I'm going to go ahead and grind for this next shot. So similar to before, I'm using a 17-gram basket, and I'm going to put a 16-gram dose in it. So I've got my 17 grams there, I'm getting my scale ready, and I'm weighing my input, and that's how I'm going to figure out my ratio and achieve my ratio. So if I'm doing 16 times 2.5, that's how I would determine my output. So how much coffee in to how much water out. So 16 grams of coffee in times or multiplied by 2.5 would equal 42 grams out. So that's what I'm going to be looking for overall with this shot of coffee. And again, I just had to make the grind slightly coarser to get the water through a little bit faster. You can see there I've got my flat shot. So let's see my first adjustment. This is my first adjustment at that 1 to 2.5 ratio. So I go ahead and lock in the portafilter, and I'm super excited to see this shot. So I'm putting my cup down. I'm not really paying attention to where the cup's positioned, and I'm starting it. But I'm looking for the 16 grams in to 42 grams out in the same amount of time before. So 30 seconds is what I'm going to be shooting for. Oh man, and you can see right off the bat, it just gushes out. It's channeling everywhere, which is multiple streams of espresso. And it's just, you can see the stream of espresso itself is watery. It doesn't look like viscous honey or warm honey. It's just gushing out, and the whole process took 17 seconds. So that shot was way too fast, which means I adjusted my grind slightly too coarse. So when I tasted that shot, what I tasted was only partial extraction. So it was under extracted. So I tasted all of the salt and all of the acid, but no sugar, because the water had just simply not spent enough time with the coffee to dissolve the sugars. So now I need to make another grind adjustment. In this case, I'm going to adjust it slightly finer to make it a little bit slower. So it'll take longer than 17 seconds is what I'm looking for. So just a few notches on this Mazzer Luxd grinder is the adjustment that I'm going to make to slow the water down so it has more time to dissolve those sugars. So after I make that adjustment, let's see that same ratio again. So I have the 1 to 2.5 ratio, and I'm doing 16 grams in, same as the dark roast shot, and I'm going to shoot for 42 grams out, which is just 16 times 2.5 equals 42 grams. So I'll stop the shot at 42 grams. And you can see already the shot looks way better. There's less channeling. There's one consistent stream of espresso, and that stream has some viscosity to it. It looks like warm honey. It's not super watery until the end here, and it just looks creamy and thick. And that entire shot took 29 seconds. So that's exactly what I was looking for. And I achieved that just by manipulating the grind. I made it slightly finer. And that allowed the water to sit longer with the coffee and dissolve those sugars. So I still have all that acidity and salt that I had in the shot before, but it's balanced out by the sweetness of the sugar. So what I'm tasting is confirming that my recipe is correct. It's within that 22 to 32 seconds. It's the ratio that I wanted, and I'm tasting sweetness, I'm tasting acidity. This is a good, properly extracted shot of espresso. So as we wrap up, you may be thinking, well, which am I paying attention to, the roast level or the brew ratio? In my opinion, it's not roast level versus brew ratio necessarily. Roast level is dictating or suggesting places that you could go with your brew ratio if you so chose. So I like to think of it as roast level and brew ratio, not necessarily roast level versus brew ratio. They work in partnership together to create a really good shot. You need to kind of consider them all, consider the whole coffee bean holistically to make your decision about what brew ratio to use. So just for fun, let's see both of those shots side by side. I've got my darker roast and my lighter roast, my two different ratios. So which one is better? Well, ultimately, I can't decide that for you. You have to be able to decide that for yourself, because they are very different in terms of brew strength with the two different ratios. And then also with the roast level, obviously the darker roast will have slightly roastier flavor, the lighter roast more citrus and fruit tones, and that's all personal preference. So whatever you gravitate to, these are both well-extracted shots of espresso that fell within that range of proper extraction. So the answer is both of these are correct, but which one is better is your call. So wrapping up, thank you so much for being here. I know you probably have a ton of questions for the Q&A. I'm excited to hear what this brought up for you and to start talking about it in new and different ways. Thank you so much for being here, taking time out of your day. I hope you learned something. I hope I can clarify more in the Q&A. And ultimately, I just hope that you have a blast experimenting and tasting your espresso. Just have a great time.
All right, bear with me as I come back to life here. All right, hello. I hope you got something out of that video. I have a ton of questions sent to me by Ben from Marzocco Home that I was reading, very excited to talk about some of it with you. So just a few things from the video that I stated, but I think I need to clarify. At one point, I stated for TDS that the ideal TDS is between 18 and 22%. I actually meant extraction percentage. It's nerdy, but it's slightly different than TDS. TDS, total dissolved solids, is a slightly different number. It would be between 7 and 12 TDS, but if you're into TDS, I just wanted to clarify that. If you're not, don't worry about it. I'm sure I'll have more questions about TDS here in just a second. So one question that I was really excited about right away was someone wrote in and said, I love the floral quality of Ethiopian single origin beans. What can I do to reduce the acidic taste that I keep coming up with? I'm using 18 grams, so 18 grams of dried coffee on a 1:2 ratio. So that would be 36 grams of liquid out with a 10-second pre-infusion time. I'm using a GS3. So there's one thing that I don't know in that, all that great information that you gave me, and this is a really great example, is how long it's taking for all of that to extract. Because the time that it's exposed to water can have a big impact on whether or not those sugars get released into the actual espresso itself. So in general, Ethiopian coffees tend to be some of the most dense of the coffees. They need a longer contact time with water generally. But the other thing I wanted to touch on was, how do I reduce the acidic taste? You can't like change what's already in the bean. So if the bean itself has a high degree of acidity, you can't really erase that, but you can add in sugars to try to balance that. So my suggestion would be trying a longer ratio, or trying something that is more like a 1 to 2.5, or even a 1 to 3, to see if that really dense Ethiopian bean, you can develop more sugars by exposing it to more water. Would be just a general suggestion for that specifically. But that's a question I get a lot, is I love the floral characteristics, but I'm not such a big fan of acidity. Experiment with different Ethiopian coffees from different regions, and there are different regions that are super acidic and ones that are more floral, and that just all comes through experimentation and playing with coffee for sure. But that was a really great question. So let's go and look at another one here. How does elevation drive coffee density? So a couple times I mentioned the elevation that the coffee is grown at. The higher the elevation, generally speaking, the more dense the bean itself. So the way that I understand it is the lower elevation coffees, so things that are like 1,500 meters or lower, they don't have to work as hard to grow. So they're kind of sitting in like a nice warmer climate. Things are a little bit easier for them. Generally, those coffees tend to be very high producing coffees, so they have a high yield of coffee cherry, but they're not, because they're producing more, the flavor is a little bit more diffuse throughout. The higher elevation coffees, the higher that the coffee grows, the harder the plant itself has to work, and the less yield the plant itself will have. So instead of having a ton of coffee cherry, it has maybe half of that amount, but the cherry that it does have, the plant has packed everything it has into it. So you're getting a ton of acidity and a ton of sugar and sweetness and complexity, because the plant, it's like a quality over quantity kind of thing. And that's my understanding of it. There's lots of really great research out there from farmers specifically. Those are the people that I would reference in terms of finding out what's happening at origin. But that's my understanding of how elevation impacts the bean. And just from dialing in, just over the years, I've definitely noticed the higher the elevation, the more dense it is, and generally the hotter the temperature I need, and also the more contact time, either through finding the grind and having a really long exposure in terms of time, or by increasing the ratio or the volume and using like a 1:3 ratio, which is more of a lungo or long shot style. So that's great. All right, so another question that I got, I think, a few times was, how important is it to begin extraction immediately after inserting the portafilter into the machine? Are there negative results if you put the portafilter in and wait like 30 seconds before extraction? Like say you lock it in and you forgot to put the cup underneath. And so you like go and run and you get the cup and you set it. I do that all the time, almost every morning. I'm making coffee and I'm distracted, but it's not ideal. If you think about your machine, it's set around 200 some degrees, and it's also a damp environment. And so as soon as you lock your portafilter in, it gets exposed to heat and moisture, even if you're not running the shot. And so it starts to actually change the puck itself, and you're not going to have as even of an extraction. There might be a few water drops that hit the top of it, and as soon as water touches your coffee, it starts extracting. So then when you do start your shot or slide your brew paddle over, there's going to be some coffee that's already been like steeping for a while, and so you might end up getting some off flavors or flavors of uneven extraction. So my recommendation is you grind, tamp, and then you lock it in and pull your shot right away. Some of that is mise en place, is having your bar set up the way that will make it most efficient for you. So you have everything within reach. You can see I have the cups on top of the machine here. I know not every space allows for that, but having everything within arm's reach will reduce the likelihood of you making that mistake. Even though it'll still be okay, or maybe even really tasty, but it's just less than ideal. So really great question, and I'll go back to my phone here and see what else I can answer. All right. So this was another one of my favorites. So someone wrote into a roaster and asked like, how would I pull or extract this coffee? And the roaster wrote back in true coffee dork fashion. I really love the detail that they went into. But this is what the person who wrote in received from the roaster. They said, our current espresso recipe is a 1 to 2.25 ratio, with an 8 TDS, total dissolved solids, which equals right around a 22% extraction. Usually this will take longer water to coffee contact times, which pre-infusion does help. So that's a ton of information, kind of touching on all the stuff that we just talked about. So first they say our current recipe is a 1 to 2.25 ratio. So right away you have a ratio that you can start with. So if I were dialing this in on my mini, I would say, okay, what size is my basket? It's a 17-gram basket. I can dose again plus or minus 1 gram. So I can go from 16 all the way up to 18. It just is your preference. So say I dose this at 16 grams. I would then multiply it by that 2.25, which would, if you do the math, equal like 36 grams out. And then the TDS, the 8 TDS, and then the extraction of 22, that's less important if you don't have access to a refractometer. So that's like good information. If I was working at a cafe and I wanted to take the TDS at home, it might be less helpful. But the specific thing that I want to call out is then they said, usually this will take longer water to coffee contact times, which pre-infusion does help with. So to me, they're giving me a clue that this is going to be a pretty dense coffee, because they're saying that this coffee wants to be exposed to water for a longer amount of time. So I'm thinking it's more dense, so I probably need a higher ratio, maybe something that 2.25 indicates a higher ratio. And then I also am probably going to be shooting more to that 30 to 32 second range to properly develop all of the sugars in it. And then they mentioned pre-infusion. Pre-infusion does help, is what they said. Pre-infusion, which is an option on some machines, is where when you start your shot, it introduces lower pressure to your coffee, and then you can gradually increase through a variety of methods, depending on your machine, the pressure over the course of the shot. So again, this machine's set at 9 bars of pressure. So when I turn it on, it hits it with 9 bars of pressure like a fire hose. Say you want to gradually ramp that up. That's what pre-infusion is. And pre-infusion can be very helpful for really dense coffees, or like African super light roast coffees, because the water hits that dense coffee and it kind of just like pools on top. And you have your grind finer because you want to have the grounds exposed to have more surface area so that the water can penetrate into the bean and develop those sugars faster. But if you just hit it with 9 bars, it's just going to kind of pool on top and be really muddy and look like it's choked. And then your shot might take 40 to 50 seconds. So by maintaining your fine grind, but gradually soaking it with like 3 to 6 bars of pressure for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, it's prepping the bed. So when it does get hit with the 9 bars of pressure, it's able to actually make its way through, and it doesn't get sort of choked off by all of the fine grounds. So that's just a quick aside on pre-infusion as well, because I know we had a few questions about it. Pre-infusion is definitely something to play with. In this case, I was using a lighter roast on a full 9 bars. In general, I don't miss having access to pre-infusion, but it is a fun tool to play with. So for example, our GS3 MP or manual paddle is a true pre-infusion machine, and you can control the pressure with the paddle itself. Super fun to play with. It just introduces one more variable. So if you're into experimentation, that's a really great machine to have. Okay, so let's see what other questions we have here. Would it be better to start dialing in by changing the water temperature or adjusting the grind? Well, it depends. So for roast level, if I was changing from a super light roast to a really super dark roast, I would right off the bat just adjust the temperature a little bit. Just because I know there's such a difference in the density of the bean because of roast level that I'm probably not going to want 203 degrees for a super syrupy, chocolatey, classic shot of espresso. So if I'm thinking about it in today's experiment in terms of roast level, I would change the temperature just if I was changing from a light roast to a dark roast. I wouldn't change it from shot to shot. I wouldn't necessarily adjust my temperature to 199 for my dark roast and then taste something and say, that's not good enough, and then adjust my temperature. I set it and then I just leave it and maintain it as a constant. So in terms of roast level or switching bags of coffee, maybe you switch roasters all the time. I know I do. I like experimenting and trying stuff from all over. It's just something to consider with a new bag of coffee. What's the elevation on this coffee? Is this a roaster who historically has been super light or super dark? And it kind of informs where you would start. And then from there, after choosing my ratio, everything else would be done with my grind. So grind being the best way to kind of affect change in the concentration of your coffee. So that was a really great question. There's a few others here. There was one that I saw. Let's see if I can find it. So on the video, the dark roast shot, I said that it was slightly over extracted. And so the next time that I pulled that same shot, I would probably coarsen my grind or try to get it through a little bit faster. Because if you remember on the video, the darker roast shot, I got 28 grams out in about 30 seconds. And I said my ideal would be 27 to 28 seconds. So why would I not just stop it at 27 to 28 seconds? Like, why would I even bother adjusting my grind? Well, you have to keep in mind that we're aiming for a specific ratio, not necessarily a specific time. So I was pulling my shot 16 grams in to 28 grams out, and I was ending it at the weight, not the time. The time just reflects what's going on with my grind. So if I was to cut that 28 gram shot off at 27 to 28 grams, instead of the 1 to 1.75 ratio, I might have a 1 to 1.25 ratio or 1 to 1.5 ratio, which doesn't change the inherent flavor of the coffee, but it affects the concentration. So it'd be a much more intense shot, and it wouldn't be what I was going for in the first place. So again, that ratio is what I'm aiming for, and time is just telling me what's going on with my grind. So the reason I didn't just cut it off early is because I was trying to maintain my brew ratio above all other things. So that was a really great question. Awesome. So let's see what else we have here. There's one that I just wanted to touch on really quick because maybe there are some roasters out there that could answer this in the chat. When creating espresso blends, is it okay to mix a light roasted coffee and a darker roasted coffee? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a roaster. I do know that most blends have different densities and origins of beans, and they seem to work fine, but there's an art to it that a roaster would definitely be able to talk about better than I. So if you're that person out there, feel free to chime in on the chat and talk about it. I know there's a whole school of thought with roasting of pre-roast blends where you roast Are you blend all your beans before roasting from all the different regions and post-roast blends, where you blend your different components like your Sumatran and your Guatemalan and maybe your Ethiopian, you roast them all separately and then you blend them together. But aside from that, I don't know what is like good or kosher to do. Generally, I buy a blend already made by the roaster and then I use it. I'm not mixing my light and my dark roast at home necessarily, just because I don't know, the ratios or how that would come out. And, I'm dealing with limited resources like everyone else, right? So I don't want to waste coffee experimenting, but if you have access to maybe some more coffee and you want to play around with that, definitely feel free to do that. Experimentation is the best way to figure out what is true in your situation. All right. So someone said, my first shot always pulls a few seconds early compared to my next. Is this common and why does this happen? There's a few. So you start your shot, you brand new shot, maybe you come in the morning and your machine's on and you pull your first shot of espresso and you pull it to your ratio and it's maybe 25 seconds. And then you pull your next shot and it's 28 or 29 seconds. Why the difference? If you've kept everything constant. There's a few things that can go on. A lot of grinders have ground retention. So they actually hang on to a little bit of ground coffee or along the burrs or in maybe the grind chamber if it has one. And so there's a little bit of pre-ground coffee and you can think about it as getting old or stale overnight. So if you go to pull your shot first thing in the morning and you don't purge a little bit of coffee out of your grinder, it's going to be like old coffee with fresh coffee. So the old coffee in the bottom of the portafilter, fresh coffee on top, and then it's going to extract unevenly. And generally the older coffee that's exposed to air for longer, it just kind of gives up the ghost right away. It just lets everything go. So it's going to give you a few seconds faster brew time. Could be one reason for it. Other reasons that are less, harder to assess is maybe you're tamping differently, or maybe you settle it a few times the first time, and the next time you use the finger distribution method, and then the next time you use a distributor. Those are all of the different variables. But my guess would be that your grinder's burrs are cold first shot, and then also that you have some old coffee hanging out around the burrs that's going to be affecting your extraction. So I usually will purge about a half shot out, like take a cup or your portafilter and dose into the portafilter, and then just dump that. It's a little bit wasteful, definitely. You can use it as a fertilizer for your garden. You can use it as a sprinkling on your tiramisu. You can find a use for it, but definitely you want to purge a little bit if you have a grinder that has ground retention. So let's see what other questions we have here. If you need a higher out with extraction time, would you generally adjust the grind coarser or maybe tamp lighter? I was never sure which typically takes priority. So for me, my school of thought is never change your tamp. So tamp should not be a variable, your tamp pressure. So if you're tamping lighter for some shots or harder for other shots, will you get a difference? Yeah, absolutely. Could you replicate that difference? Probably not, because we're human, we're fallible. And so if I think I'm tamping lighter one time and I'm going to try to replicate that light tamp the next time, I might be tamping 5 pounds of pressure different. But to me, it feels the same. And so then I develop a super inconsistent shots. So in my espresso basics, I talked about pressing down, tamping, as hard as you can without straining or hurting yourself until the coffee, it compresses until it stops moving. As soon as it stops compressing, you can't really get it to compress any more than that. And that ends up being between 30 and 50 pounds of pressure. And you want to do that every time. Compress the coffee until it stops moving every time, and then adjust the grind. So the grind should be the top of the list in terms of variables that you're adjusting. Because if you're messing with tamp, will you get a result? Sure, but again, it's just not repeatable or consistent, generally speaking. So that's my opinion on that. Definitely experiment and have fun out there. But just, I've seen it not pan out for a lot of people. So that's my suggestion. All right, let's see what else here. Everything you've mentioned is great, thank you. How does what you said vary with water types? So again, I'll preface preface this by saying that I'm not a scientist, but that water has a huge impact in terms of coffee extraction. There's lots of research out there. There's something called Water for Coffee, which is a book that you can get written by someone from MIT. Super great if you're into the science of those sorts of things. But if you think about water sort of having a capacity, if you have super hard water with lots of minerals, maybe your machine scales, and you try to pull a shot of espresso, that water is already pretty full of mineral. So it doesn't have enough or as much room, I guess, to be able to grab onto some of those amino acids and different things in coffees and break them down, because it's already sort of like chock full. So you're going to have poorer extraction with hard water. On the opposite side of the coin, if you didn't have any minerals in your water, say it's distilled, you try to pull a shot of espresso, it actually needs some mineral content to be able to dissolve the coffee properly. So if your water is too soft, you can also have issues with extraction and how it affects roast and all of those sorts of things. That is to say, knowing the makeup of your water, if you can get a water test, is going to be really helpful for you to have better tasting coffee overall and more consistent extraction. It's also interesting because a lot of roasters will roast to the water quality of their area. So then if you're buying their coffee in a different part of the world or a different part of the United States and you try to use it at home, maybe it tastes or acts differently than what they are experiencing in their cafe. So knowing sort of what they're working with and what you're working with overall will have a better end result. I really like Third Wave Water. It's a company, you can buy these little packets, dump it into a gallon of distilled water, shake it around, and then it has a good mix of minerals and everything that it needs. So you pour it into your machine and it will properly extract your coffee, make everything taste really great. So that's one recommendation. If you don't have access to a water test or the filtration that you would need would be too expensive, definitely something to consider when you're pulling espresso. So let's see what else here. I'm looking. So someone said, what is your cleaning machine routine, daily, weekly, monthly, and PMs, which is preventative maintenance for a home machine? So I talked about this a little bit in Espresso Basics, but I'll touch on it again. You can't really over-clean your machine, and I don't say that as a challenge for someone to try to over-clean their machine, but coffee has oil in it that can go rancid. So when I was working at the La Marzocco Cafe, for instance, we would backflush or clean the group head with chemical at shift change. So that could be up to 3 times a day because of the volume of espresso that we were doing. But at home, when I'm cleaning my machine, I'm probably backflushing it like every 2 days to 3 days. But I would recommend at least once a week, because you don't want any of those coffee oils like hanging out in your group head and going rancid and then producing off flavors in your coffee. So generally speaking, I'm backflushing at least once a week, typically every 2 to 3 days. And then in terms of preventative maintenance, it varies so much machine to machine. But speaking to La Marzocco, obviously, because I work for them, I'm doing preventative maintenance on my machine at like a 6-month and year basis, where I'm just kind of assessing and seeing where things are at. Potentially, we might do a preventative maintenance class where I would get more into that. But there's just a few things to look at, some vacuum breaker things to check, and then the screen that's actually dispersing the water, the dispersion screw that holds the screen in, and then the gasket that goes around the group head that seals your portafilter. Those are usually replaced on a yearly basis. Just a few things to keep in mind, but definitely cleaning your machine will lead to better tasting espresso. So I would recommend at least once a week, for sure. All right, so let's see. What is considered higher elevation or low elevation? So I'll speak just generally to my knowledge. So anything for me above like 1,600 meters above sea level or higher, especially anything above 2,000 meters above sea level, that's going to be for me a higher elevation coffee. 1,500 meters and below, that to me is going to be a lower elevation coffee. Anything below 1,000 meters above sea level is definitely like a super low elevation coffee. And usually there's the 2 types of coffee. There's Robusta and Arabica. Generally anything below 1,000 meters is Robusta, and anything above is Arabica. It's just 2 different coffee plants and where they like to grow. And again, roasters and importers could maybe share a little bit more information about that. Cafe Imports is an importer that I really like. Their website has a ton of information about origins and their specific like growing conditions and the elevations that coffee is grown at. So just a general rule of thumb for me, if I look at a bag and I see anything like 2,000 meters above sea level, I know it's probably an African coffee, something Ethiopian, and it's probably going to be really, really dense. And then anything between like 1,600 and 2,000, and then is going to be sort of like medium to low, and then anything below 1,500 is going to be super low. All right, so let's do one or two more here. I know we're just about to finish up, but I just want to make sure I answer as many of these as I can, because this is my favorite part of doing this, is getting to see what questions you have about it. If my machine can't adjust temperature, how to compensate with grind or grams in? So if you have a machine at home and you can't manipulate the temperature of the brew, how do you compensate for that? Definitely, I would say grind. Like the grams in has to do with your ratio. So thinking about your coffee like we did today, okay, is this a lighter or darker roast? It's a darker roast. And I've experimented, and I think that I tend to like really short shots, like a 1-to-1 ristretto. Okay, so I'm gonna do 16 grams in to 16 grams out, and I need to do that within 22 to 32 seconds, ideally. So then you would manipulate your grind. So it's like everything is connected to something else. So it's both your dose in and your grind that you would adjust. Temperature, it's just really nice to be able to manipulate that, because you can subtly kind of tamper with that extraction process. But if you don't have access to that, definitely paying a lot of attention to your ratio and then paying attention to your grind is going to be super helpful. And it's not impossible to get a great shot if you don't have access to temperature. It's just easier to when you do have access to temperature. All right, let's do one more here. Would you please explain more about the effects of process on dialing in? So I talked a little bit about the coffee process, and I'm going to address this just kind of quickly since we're running out of time. But the process of coffee can affect overall bean density for a few reasons. So when coffee is picked, it's actually a cherry. Coffee is a fruit, and the pit is the coffee bean itself. Usually there's two coffee beans side by side like this, which is why one side of your coffee bean is flat. And then after it's been picked, how the producer deals with that fruit that surrounds the bean, that's the processing. So if they immediately strip it off using water, it's usually called a wet process. So they're just stripping it off and leaving just the bean and drying just the bean in the sun. That's a washed processed coffee. Say they leave the cherry around the bean and they dry it like a raisin in the sun. That's called a natural processed coffee. And typically you'll get really fruity, intense, fermenty flavors in general. So in terms of thinking about how it affects density, I've found natural processed coffees, those like cherry raisin-like coffees that have the fruit punch flavors that we all gravitate to sometimes, I think. Blueberry is the one that I get a lot. I find that they are less dense, and there's probably a lot happening in terms of fermentation to make that the case when the bean itself is being processed. And then I typically find washed processed coffees tend to be more dense. But that's just my experience. I don't have a scientific backing for that. I'm sure that exists out there. But typically if I'm looking at a naturally processed coffee, I'm thinking like maybe I need to pull this just slightly shorter overall in terms of my ratio. So not quite as tall or long of a shot. And also I don't maybe need to kick up my temperature quite as much. And then with a washed processed coffee, typically slightly more dense. And so I would make the adjustments that I would use for a more dense coffee. Okay, so those are really great questions. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I really appreciate you all being here, taking the time to learn with me today. I've been getting a ton of emails from people all over the world, along with my coworkers at La Marzocco Home, and we just really appreciate that you're taking the time to talk with us and build this community. So thank you so much. Please check out our Instagram. It's at La Marzocco Home, and our website, which is home.lamarzocousa.com. And you can find out more information there about future classes and that sort of thing. Just one moment here. If you do want to email me, you can reach me at leah@lamarzocco.com. And then the director of La Marzocco Home / my friend, Dave, is dave@lamarzocco.com. Any questions that you have about this class or anything that you want to follow up with us on, we would love to hear from you. Again, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a blast for your weekend and you make better coffee at home. So thanks, y'all.